So today I'm joined by Kerry Holly, an IBM Fellow, distinguished architect, and the most respected voice in enterprise technology and innovation. Kerry has spent decades shaping how some of the world's largest organizations think about systems, architecture, and now AI, not just as a technology, but as something that fundamentally changed how people work, decide, and create value. Thank you very much, Kerry, for joining me today, and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Me too. Me too. Perhaps we can start with a little bit of a backstory about your life and experience. Maybe you can shed a little bit more light what you've been doing throughout your life career, and explain a little bit more in detail to our audiences and listeners why you're so unique and what you've done in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start in childhood and fast forward to the adulthood. But I think what's unique about my story is, I mean, some aspects are unique, but some are fairly common. I grew up in a very poor neighborhood. My grandmother raised me, and my brother and sister spent a lot of time at a children's center, which really formed a lot of foundational skills of basic reading and writing, complemented what was not the greatest of educational system at the time that I experienced growing up. But Sue Duncan was a mentor of mine and a formative lady in my life. I went to a very new high school in Chicago at the time. That's where I grew up, in Chicago, Illinois, in the States. And that high school, in order to go there, you needed to live in the neighborhood. So Sue allowed me to use her address to go to the school. The reason that's sort of critical to the story is because at that time, it was not very common for people to be writing software, to be writing computer programs. But at that school, which I mentioned was a new school, they offered basically a computer science program. We started to learn how to program basic old languages, Fortran, BASIC. But that's where I started. And that doesn't seem unusual today, but the year was 1968. And I would venture to say not too many people were writing programs at 13, 14 years of age in 1968. There wasn't the PC, there wasn't the ubiquitous nature of computing that we see today. So I got my start at a very young age, and we spent a lot of time in that lab, in that computer lab, basically punch cards, teletype, writing basic programs. When I left high school, I went to the university, mathematics major, and there weren't, again, sounds fascinating, but there weren't a lot of comp sci programs at that time in the United States. So I did mathematics. I used computers as a complementary tool for certain math courses. And I left the university as a mathematics major. I went to work as a programmer. I worked for a large retailer where I built order processing software using some very low programming languages. But that's really how I started in the industry. I got bored and decided to do something different. And again, got to remember the time frame. This is before the big tech arrival of Google and Apple and Meta and et cetera. So this was a time where the big companies, the retailers, the banks, really dictated what you were doing in the computer field, unless you were teaching as a professor or some other discipline like that, or in a research institute. So I decided to go to law school, decided to change careers, become a lawyer, finish law school, and then something magical happened, at least from my vantage point, which is that I got recruited by a tech company, a company that is now owned by HP, but at that time was the company called Tandem. Tandem built this fault-tolerant computing system. So it opened my eyes to technology. I now worked for a vendor that was actually creating the technology that companies in the world uses, and that was just a fascinating experience for me to join Tandem. From there, I joined IBM, where, to be blunt, that's where I spent the most of my career. I had a number of great colleagues and experiences. I was able to do quite a few things. One of the things that established a reputation for me at IBM, this was again in the early 80s, is that I was assigned on a project as a chief architect on something a lot of people didn't think could be done, at least in the time frame that was required, and that was to build a new banking system for this large bank in the San Francisco area that had just done a major acquisition. So I was the chief architect tasked with building this teller system and we were wildly successful. We finished ahead of time. It was a very successful implementation, and from there, I did a lot of various projects at IBM. That's where I became the first African American distinguished engineer because of a lot of the system engineering work I had done. I also became the second African American fellow. But at IBM, that's where a lot of my accomplishments in tech were done. That's where I established a concept. I didn't establish the concept, but I certainly spent a lot of energy with the team that I was in charge of, helping IBM understand the value at that time of something called service-oriented architecture, which as its backbone was using something called web services. And not to get into the technology at this point, but that technology became very instrumental in a lot of tech that would follow in terms of cloud services and so forth. But it established me as a leader in the IBM company. It's why recently, as of last year, I got into the National Inventors Hall of Fame because of some inventions around that technology. So that was really a large part of my career. It's because of the work I did there. I retired from IBM, spent a year at Cisco as a CTO VP of an analytics portfolio that we had there. I then left that company out after about a year and joined a healthcare company where I spent about 4 years, maybe a little bit longer. Had a varied role there. I was their first technical fellow. I ran a series of programs there. One of them was a team of about 150 or so individuals comprised of data scientists, researchers, PhDs. But basically, we were a think tank to launch a lot of AI activity in that company. And I introduced, along with my team, the concept of moving away, or I should say complementing, machine learning with this other subset of machine learning, deep learning. But we did a lot of interesting things there. We started some early work using BERT, some large language models, and from there I got recruited by Google. I spent about 3 or 4 years at Google and decided to retire. And I've spent my time now doing things like this, talking to people, but also writing. I spent a lot of my time trying to help a larger population at large understand AI, what's mythology about it, what's real about it, and how it can be applied in not only our daily lives, but in society as a whole. So that's sort of a quick summation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing this very, very interesting career, very interesting journey, and yeah, story you've shared with us. So if you were starting your career today, what would you know, even though everyone says it's essential? Have you got any thoughts on this?
Something that I would ignore, but everyone says is essential.
Yes.
Well, that's a great question and an interesting question. As I think about that, today there's a ton of conversation, as you know, around artificial intelligence. And I would say there's a lot of noise that I would assert is not 100% accurate. Maybe the accuracy is closer to 20%. And that's the part I would ignore. But it's gotten so much attention that it just dominates. So what is that? Specifically, this notion that comp sci is no longer needed, that developers are being replaced by AI or subsets of AI or tools of AI like vibe coding. So I would ignore that. I think I have an 18-year-old who is pursuing a comp sci at the university level, and I encourage him to pursue his dreams and his interests because yes, there's a lot of things that AI will replace, but there's a lot of things that it won't replace. And even the guy who coined the term vibe coding has put shade on that notion that it will replace programmers. One of the mistaken notions that percolates in a lot of people's minds is that software development, the problem that we're facing is writing software. And that unfortunately has never been the problem, writing software fast. We've been able to write software fast using a number of techniques. Some of that's just been brute force in terms of labor forces in cheaper markets. Some of that's been a variety of tools over the years. But the real problem is figuring out what to do, problem solving. And that's something that is inherently a human trait, a human activity to understand the changing nature of requirements, the constraints that you have to address in terms of speeds and feeds. So I could write a book on this, but the point is that's probably what I would ignore. The noise that's telling young people that this job will no longer be needed because of AI. And by the way, I was as I mentioned, I was in the healthcare business for quite some time. And I remember, and this is now 7, 8 years ago, I was talking with some radiologists. They had just finished their residencies and they were quite concerned of whether they would have work in the future. And there's been some well-known computer scientists publicly stated that, hey, radiologists will be out of work in X a number of years. And that was said like 4 or 5 years ago. But the point I'm making is that there's a number of data points that we know today that the work of radiologists is still in demand. It's still increasing. Yes, AI has democratized a lot of the activities they do, but it does not put radiologists out of work. In fact, the demand for radiologists is as high as it's ever been. Just another example why you got to not listen to the noise, because those radiologists were doing just that. They were listening to the noise. And one thing that's interesting about my field, computer science and computer scientists, is that unfortunately we have a number of people who are, to be blunt, are stepping out of their expertise. I, as a computer scientist, don't fully know what a radiologist does on a day-to-day basis. And we can talk about that in every job. And therefore, it's really hard to assert that AI will replace a job when there's so many aspects of the job that have nothing to do with computing. And that's where AI will shine, is where I can replace a heavy, intensive computing activity like reading x-rays, as one example.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for clarifying this. And, talking about AI in particular, everyone is, sort of mixed feelings, as you said, in radiology and other fields. Where do you think human judgment becomes more important, not less, within AI in particular? Because people fearing, obviously, still that a lot of jobs will go. AI will take over the world eventually. And, we talked before about simple tasks, maybe creating assets or helping with day-to-day tasks that could be automated. It's a good thing, but still, where would you say the human judgment would be important? Which areas, or with careers, etc.?
I think that most careers, the ones that I think that people find interesting, are ones that test what is inherently human about us, our creativity, our judgment, our need to interact with people. I'm going to say something that's going to shock people, perhaps, when I say that when you think about AI, because that term is used generically by the media, by myself and a lot of people, and we talk about AI doing this or AI doing that, or as you sort of alluded to, AI changing the world. And the radical concept that I'm going to put forward is that there is no physical thing called AI. And when you think about changing things in our world, I think you would agree that things happen, things change because of people, because of physical objects. But AI can't do anything because it's not a physical thing. So therefore, when you talk about, or when anyone talks about AI doing something, to be more specific and to be clear, we should talk about a system. Like, okay, what AI system are you talking about that will do what you just said? Because AI can't do it, because there is no such thing. And when I say thing, I mean a physical thing of AI. AI is a concept, so therefore it's a thing, but it's not a physical thing. AI is a field of study. AI comprises a set of technologies, but when famous, influential billionaires talk about AI destroying the world, it cannot possibly do that because it doesn't exist as a physical thing. The only thing that can destroy the world, arguably, would be people, would be things that people create, would be physical phenomena. You see where I'm going with this. So if you're going to describe AI as doing something bad, you really have to describe what system you're talking about. What system has been built that will do what you're describing? What system has been built that will take over the world? And as we look at the landscape today, there are no such systems. ChatGPT is a system that uses large language models like Claude and Gemini, etc. But these are very basic AI systems. There's a ton of things they can't do. No one would ever claim that ChatGPT can do what a radiologist would do. No one would ever claim that the mapping application in my car is going to somehow one day wake up and destroy me. These are sort of the claims that if you just talk through them, you can understand that, okay, wait a second, let's take a step back and be specific about, and then we can get into the technology aspects of why and how complex it would be to build systems that could destroy and take over the world, AI systems. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for clarifying this. And so, probably a tech-related last question, but you've seen like multiple technology shifts come and go. What patterns repeat every time, and what feels genuinely different this time? Maybe also AI related, maybe not. What's your call on this?
Yeah, I think one of the patterns that repeats itself consistently is a hype cycle. There's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm that translates to investments, that translates to a ton of activity, a ton of new products, some of which survive and some don't. I think that's pretty consistent with every hype cycle. It causes a change in our educational teaching. We started to embrace the use of that technology at the university and lower levels. So those are all good things. What's different about this, and I saw this when I worked at Google, is that, and I have built systems in every hype cycle. I've built major commerce systems. I built banking systems. I built internet-based systems. I have built systems across all of these frameworks from cloud, mobile, etc., and AI as well. But I have never seen the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of CEO interest about a technology as I've seen with AI. And I mentioned Google in this context because OpenAI introduced in 2022 ChatGPT. Our phones were ringing off the hook. We didn't have enough people to deal with the amount of briefings that CEOs wanted to have on what is this technology, what are its implications. Even today, if we look at the amount of investment, if we look at what's driving a large part of our world economy, it's around AI. So I would say that's uniquely different and exciting because there's still a tremendous runway of growth in the AI arena. But I think this hype cycle, or I shouldn't call it a hype cycle, this technology trend is uniquely different for a number of reasons. I think one of those is because of the potential positive impact it has on business, and of course, the potential it has to transform the way we work and the way we play and the way we think. So I think it's a tremendous and dangerous from that standpoint as well.
All right. And do you think we're gonna be or we are in the next bubble, like with the pharmacy bubble, .com bubble? Is AI gonna be the next bubble burst eventually, and
I
it's gonna kill all the weaklings, and only the big, strong companies will survive and continue to develop and dominate and create monopolies of AI technologies?
Well, that's definitely a risk. We see that today with a lot of acquisitions that are occurring where the large companies are buying some of the small startups. We see, at least in the United States, some of those companies move around our regulatory constraints or guardrails by not buying the company, instead buying the talent. And so I think that is true, that we will continue to see that trend. I think in terms of a bubble, I'm no economist, so I say that with the following point of view is that I think this one is different. I think from what I've read and heard and what I see, what I observe, no one can accurately predict when this bubble will pop. But like all bubbles, they do pop. I do think there's something fundamentally different about this, as I've articulated before. And one of those is, I mean, even though companies are still arguably challenged to find value in AI, a lot of that is because of the hype cycle. A lot of that is because there's a lot of brownfield, meaning existing systems that are very difficult to put and embrace AI into those systems. So there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of innovation and innovation coming. So I think to answer the question, I don't know the answer is number one in terms of when this bubble will burst, but I think we have some runway. I think we have some time.
Okay, hopefully, fingers crossed. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. What career advice would you give to younger people out there pursuing anything
You know,
currently, being sort of exposed to many opportunities but many challenges at the same time because we live in the AI space now, technology space? What would you say they should focus on and do, and who they should listen to, or where should they find advice and guidance to make right decisions?
Well, as with, I'm going to say something that's cliche, which is I do fundamentally think people should do what they love, should follow, and they will change over time because what I like and what I love, as I did very briefly, I liked something, changed, and then came back to it. But other people will like something better. But I think people should do what they love, what they want to pursue. I think of graphic artists as when you ask this question because I remember, I've worked with graphic designers, artists for a number of years. And I remember when the Mac first came out and computing, because these folks used to do a lot of drawing by hand. And suddenly with products like Adobe and others, it was able to automate what they used to be able to be taught to do in art school. Yet they transitioned with this new technology. The point I'm making is that I would encourage people to follow the following path. Do what you love, understand and learn technologies like, who would not be competent? You've got to understand mobile technology. You got to be able to use cloud services. If we go back decades earlier, you got to be able to use Excel or its equivalent, but spreadsheets and word processors. So in a similar manner, you need to be able to understand the internet. And of course, on fast forwarding, you need to understand AI. You need to understand tools. But I would say the big takeaway is focus on a job where there's something uniquely human about the job, which I think is problem solving, not asset creation, not just creating a spreadsheet or creating a computer program, but something that fundamentally is about engaging and problem solving and creative. And that, by the way, is going to be in health, it's going to be in medicine, it's going to be in finance, it's going to be in software development, it's going to be in every industry. So that would be a big thing I would encourage people to do, but understand the underlying technologies that help you do your work better. And I would also encourage people to be avid readers because I do think that being a good reader will open your mind, it will improve your communication, it will improve your ability to interact with people.
Well, I lived through the early days of Excel, and to date, I can't really use it, and I never understood it. For me, it's very complicated. Thanks God, this ChatGPT. When I need something and I need to use Excel, I always try to use ChatGPT to help me out. I know, but it's just.
There you have it.
I do admire people. I've recently found out that there are actually professional, proper coders and professionals who utilize Excel to its full extent, and it's just incredible. I do admire those people who can do that. It's fascinating. You did mention reading is a very good habit. People should be encouraged to do it and find some time to do it. There are some challenges we spoke before, but to read at least a book a week, maybe a month, or maybe set yourself a goal. Which books would you recommend someone to read? Have you recently either discovered or you've read in the past or you like to revisit them again? Have you got any recommendations?
I do have some thoughts. I don't know if I'd call them recommendations. One of the books that I think just in living life, The Prophet, I think is just an awesome book it's an easy read. It's a quick read. I think when I talk about being a good reader, I am, if you like self-help books, that's great, pursue them. But I also think that there's sort of two main categories that I think about in reading. And maybe that's wrong to say two, but I think that in your profession, there will be books that are both technical and non-technical that you should pursue. So in the comp sci field, there's a ton of books that I were looking and I was at one time being, pursuing my expertise in comp sci. But anyway, long story short, I am a big fan of sci-fi. So what is it? Roadside Picnic was a favorite book of mine, but it's a sci-fi book. Three Body Problem and that whole series is another favorite of mine. So I tend to like to complement my reading with things that I find of interest and fascinate me, and that's the sci-fi. And then there's the Prophet. And then, some people are pro and con on Ayn Rand, who wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Putting her politics aside, I think her books, I just found her writing style very succinct and to the point. And I remember this one conversation where one of the characters in the book is talking to another character, the architect, and the question before the person is, why don't you know what you want to do? And I think that that's not a criticism, but I think it forces you to think about why don't you? And I think when you can answer that question, you can figure out what you want to do. But I don't know if I've answered you directly, but those are just a few of some of the books that I've enjoyed over the years. I'm reading The Three Body Problem now in that whole series.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing this. All right, every generation is built differently, but today's generation facing different challenges. What would you say how some younger people can overcome it or deal with difficult situations or challenges in their life? Have you got any tips, maybe from your past or recent times you've experienced, or a habit that you've developed that help you deal with those challenges, and maybe you can pass on to our viewers or people who will watch the interview?
Our world is arguably getting more complex. There's more think and see more stress. So I do think that taking care of your body and mind is important. I do yoga every day, Bikram yoga every day. So I do think finding something physical that you enjoy is something that will keep balance in your life. I do think that reading, as I've mentioned before, not to repeat myself, I think keeps balance in your life. And trying to do work that you enjoy, I think that keeps balance as well. I also think that understanding that, even though I've had a lot of success in my career, I've also had a lot of non success. Maybe a lot is saying a bit more, but the point is there's a balance. And I think I remember my brother, my late brother, who also pursued a career in software engineering. I remember he was in a training program at one time and he was really challenged. I reminded him that, hey, guy, you used to tutor me in geometry. You can pass this program. You just have a moment of self-doubt. And I think people just need to realize that this notion of imposter syndrome, self-doubt is something we all experience. It's part of the human journey. Perseverance is really what's going to get you over the hump. And just realize that it's temporary. Just get your mind onto something more pleasant and get right back at it. And there'll be peaks and valleys that we all experience.
All right, thank you. Thank you for sharing this. What would you say is one thing you wish people understood better about aging and getting older? We never talk about this topic. It's sort of taboo, and we sort of never interact much with like older people, elders, unless it's our direct family. And I think this should be, yeah, encouraged. I think people have a lot of experience, wisdom to share and pass on. What would you say to the younger people they should be aware of and know and think about? And I don't know.
It's a good question, and given my seniority, it's a good question for me to address. I think that one of the things I push back on with people is that when people say, "Well, you can't do this because I'm old," and I do think that I know it's a cliche again to say age is a number, but I do think keeping your body, not that I'm not talking about keeping it in shape, but keeping it limber is something that will go a long way to engaging you in a healthy life. I think managing your diet in terms of good foods and your weight management and being limber. I think these are all good things to manage. And at the same time, I'm a big fan of enjoying life, enjoying what you like to eat or drink or whatever it is you like to do and put into your body. Sometimes that means moderation. But I would say the biggest thing is stay active, whether it's walking every day, whether it's doing yoga every day, or something much more demanding, whether it's cycling. Just keep active, and I think you'll find that you'll live a long and healthy life.
And looking back at your life, what's something you're most proud of? Why?
Things I'm most proud of, I would say they span a number of things. I'm proud of my children, proud of the family. I'm proud of their social awareness, their social consciousness. So I'm proud of that. From my own career standpoint, never would have imagined some of the accolades that I've been able to receive, and those make me proud. I was surprised to be inducted into the Inventors Hall of Fame last year, and the year before that into the National Academy of Engineering. I remember when I first became a distinguished engineer in IBM, and I looked around the room at some of the people who were fellows, and I never thought I would achieve that. And someone just said a kind word to me. I know that's on your agenda, or that's going to happen. And so that was something I'm very proud of, an IBM fellow at that time. So it's been all very pleasing. I've never, well, one last thing. I didn't mention the university, but I graduated from a university in Chicago, DePaul University, and I'll be blunt. I was a good student, but not the best of students. And 30 years or some later, for them to invite me to give a commencement speech was quite pleasing and flattering. So I was proud of that.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I always like to ask that question, and everyone has a different point of view, and there's not a right or wrong answer. But what do you think is the key to a successful and fulfilling life? And I'm asking this in particular because we are surrounded now by social media and the internet. And let's be honest, it's not always the right and good advice that we exposed by being rich or become millionaires overnight, good looking, accumulating materialistic things. There's nothing wrong about shooting for the stars, but I think it's always good to look from a different point of view and hear other people's points of views of what they would consider a fulfilling and successful life.
I would say embracing your family and having that family would be one aspect of a rich and fulfilling life. My family gives me lots of comfort and joy. I would say, enjoying what you do, such that it's not a drudgery, and not that every day will be filled with joy, but I think not seeing work as drudgery, and that means you have to pursue work that you enjoy. I think that would be a fulfilling life. And perhaps as important as those two things are friends. Having friends that you love to hang out with, that enrich. Maybe the last thing, I think this would be the last thing, is just, enjoy life. We as a family today, every year we go somewhere in the world to experience something we haven't experienced before, whether it's culture, whether it's a historical site, whether it's a city. But I think for other people it'll be different. But I think getting out of your habitat and exploring the world, I think would do a world of wonders for one's mental state, and at least for me, a state of happiness.
Yeah, I've heard it from many people. Traveling will broaden your horizons and your views about the world, people, and how things look like. I mean, it doesn't have to be abroad, it could be local, but at least in a different city, maybe. That's
Yes.
always worthwhile exploring and pursuing. And a lot of people keep saying that traveling is probably the number one thing they would recommend to yeah, have a fulfilling life.
Yep. High on my list.
What's a piece of advice you received that stuck with you throughout your life, and why? Was there someone who inspired you in particular, and you kept at the end close to your heart?
One of the pieces of advice that someone gave me was years ago, a few decades ago, in the early part of my career, where I did have a pretty significant responsibility. One of my early significant responsibilities, where we were building the system, and we had a number of challenges, and we had a number of doubters. There was a lot of pressure on me, a lot of pressure on the team. And I remember a colleague came up to me, and this is old news in today's world, where he said something simply as, just remember, everyone who's telling you that this can't be done is simply telling you that they've never done it before. And that has always stuck with me as true, and to not let doubters influence my pathway. So that's, I would say, is probably the most significant advice I've ever been given.
That's really good advice. What's something you think society could do better to support younger people? I mean, you said you've got a 12-year-old daughter. You think something should or could change to make future generations' lives better?
I do think our education system is key here. I don't know as much, of course, about the systems in Europe or the UK, but you may remember, I mentioned the children's center I went to as a kid. I started at that center when I was 6, and all the way till 28, I participated in that center. But Sue Duncan is the lady who ran that center. She recently passed away about a year ago. I think she reached the ripe old age of 90. Her son, Arnie Duncan, he used to be in the United States, the Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. But Arnie and I have been friends for a number of decades. But I remember him telling me how the schools represent a untapped resource, because you have all this space, you have all these facilities, and yet there's a fixed window of time during the day. So back to your question, I think the schools afford us a tremendous opportunity, which we haven't fully tapped. Today, at least in the United States, and particularly in California, we don't have the best primary school systems for our youth. We could do better. Unfortunately, a lot of the independent schools are doing better. But I think that's where we have an opportunity across the world to create and use our school system, because most kids in the world, and I know that's not true everywhere in the world, but they go to school. It's where we can feed them. It's where we can make life fun. It's where we can motivate them. And I think that's a untapped avenue. I think we've used schools as largely an instrument of pushing content, where we could not only do that, but do more. So I do think schools is where I would start. And I see this in independent schools, And I think we could, this model, and not that there's one model, but I think it could have a tremendous positive effect on the world if we embraced those institutions and the people who make up those, the teachers and so forth.
Last two questions. Thank you very much. You've been very thorough. A lot of very interesting stories I've heard from you. This is our third conversation, but I really enjoyed the stories you share with me. What's something you're excited about the future, whether it's for yourself or the world as a whole? Is there anything?
Well, I think the climate in the United States gives people pause for disillusionment and pessimism. But I look at what happened in Davos by the Canadians and European leaders, and it gives me great joy to see there's a ton of leaders across the world that believe in people and humanity and the desire for all of us to live, more productive and productive maybe the wrong word, but the pursuit of happiness. I think that technology will help us. I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think that better leadership, better technology, I've always remained optimistic about our world, even though we have these peaks and valleys.
Your final word of wisdom to pass on to the younger generations.
It's probably just a repeat of what I've said. Just continue to do what you enjoy. It's hard to know what you don't know, but just keep learning. And some of that is by doing things that are uncomfortable. I would encourage the youth to, especially in the ages pre-college, pre-university, just experience and enjoy life. One of the things I've told my 18-year-olds is college can be some of the most memorable, positive, fun experiences of your life. And so take advantage of it to find your tribe and embrace, these new friendships that will last you a lifetime.
Wonderful. Kerry, thank you very much. I genuinely really enjoyed this conversation and the other ones that we had as well. Fantastic stories, wisdom, and I can only thank you again for taking the time to speak to me today and share everything with our listeners, our audience, and I hope we get to stay in touch in the future. Yeah, thank you very much again.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And thanks for having me.